Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, I wanted to have a look at the prospects of conflict between the People's Republic of China, the People's Liberation Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, ground forces, against the Republic of China, better known as Taiwan. Now, there has been a recent war scenario conducted by the Daily Mail. Now, there have been a wide array of these military simulations talking about what a war between China and Taiwan would look like. Now, for the amateur that is watching the prospects of this conflict possibly emerging, the amateur, the uninformed urbanite, by and large, with no practical military experience, never serving in any armed forces around the world, what you normally hear is that because China has this vastly larger number of troops, in theory millions, that China would simply overwhelm Taiwan. And it is much more, significantly more nuanced than just a million Chinese troops conducting some sort of human wave amphibious operation across the Straits of Taiwan and attacking one of the most hardened military island nation states on the planet. Much, much different than that is often talked about. Again, most of the time it's the million-man float over to Taiwan, thus overwhelming the island nation of Taiwan with air power, ballistic missiles, and then eventually this massed attack that would take place. Now, we also talk about the intervention of the United States. The United States cannot allow China to take Taiwan for a number of different reasons. It is not going to allow that. Now, you hear about that if this war were to take place, that the United States, in all probability, would take large numbers of casualties. And again, the uninformed urbanite believes that the United States is going to ship over an airborne division, a division of Marines. They're going to put aircraft carriers in the Strait of Taiwan and then let the Chinese attack those aircraft carriers with hypersonic ballistic missiles and what have you. That's not what's going to happen. And then this last scenario that we saw by the Daily Mail, using amateur poker chips designed as units, went over said scenario. And again, it ends up being this possibly third World War with large numbers of casualties. You've got to understand something. There's a high probability that if the United States were to intervene against China, that there is a very real possibility. Now, I know this is going to shock some. This is going to shock some people. That the United States could take zero casualties in such a conflict. Now, you're probably immediately scratching your head and thinking that maybe I have gone insane. Well, that's not the case. There is a way that the United States could fight this conflict, prevent the Chinese from taking Taiwan, making it so utterly costly with very, very little loss of U.S. materiel and lives. How would that happen? Well, first, the U.S. would pull back its most valuable targets. It would pull back its large surface fleet. It would keep that large surface fleet many thousands of miles away from mainland China, and that surface fleet would be mobile. The air bases in Japan and Guam and other areas would also vacate some of these military targets. Is it possible that China would launch attacks against Guam? Possibly. But the U.S. could mitigate that in terms of losses. Because again, the real goal, the primary goal of the U.S. is to make it so costly and prevent a Chinese amphibious landing and or blockade of Taiwan. And how is it going to do that? How is the U.S. going to prevent a blockade and an amphibious operation against Taiwan? Well, the amphibious component of this war is very unlikely. China would have to gain air supremacy over Taiwan, and they would have to feel comfortable in sending large numbers of amphibious warfare ships across the Straits of Taiwan to then land on Taiwan, which in and of itself would be a highly contested amphibious operation that just in and of itself would have a high degree of possible failure. High degree of possible failure. So this idea of this massive amphibious operation by the Chinese landing on the western coast or even the eastern coast of Taiwan is really something I think at this point China is not considering. I really don't think the Chinese are considering that element of its strategy, the amphibious operation. So what are they considering? Well, they're considering a blockade. They're considering utilizing its navy to surround Taiwan and at the same time use ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and its air force to try and gain some semblance of air dominance, air superiority over Taiwan. That's going to be very difficult. Very, very difficult, especially the air component of this. Taiwan has a very robust air defense network in place. They have Patriots. They have their own indigenous, very advanced weapon systems of ground-to-air air defense systems. Much more robust than what you would see right now, or you are seeing in the Ukraine. It always kind of harkens back to the Ukraine. But again, the technology that Taiwan possesses is much more advanced than the technology that the Ukraine possessed to the lead up to of the invasion by the Russian Federation. Much more advanced. So, what methodology would the U.S. use that would be low cost in terms of lives and material to prevent this blockade? Well, here it is. And I've talked about this before, but I want to reiterate this. The U.S. subsurface fleet, meaning its nuclear attack submarines, the LA class, the Seawolf class, the Virginia class, and even to some extent the Ohio class that has been converted to sea-launched cruise missiles. One of these Ohio class submarines can launch 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles against ground targets, sea targets. But the reality is this middle one right here, the Virginia class. Just a dozen or so Virginia class submarines operating around Taiwan, east of Taiwan, to the north, to the south. Just a dozen Virginia class submarines would cause havoc, would cause absolute havoc to the Chinese blockade scenario. You've got to understand something. The technology that is in these submarines, the subsurface fleet, is far more advanced than anyone really even understands. Yes, the Chinese have a large number of diesel-electric submarines. They have some nuclear-powered attack submarines as well. But the U.S. subsurface fleet is many times more advanced than the subsurface fleet of the Chinese. And when I mean many times, I'm talking about a generational leap ahead of Chinese subsurface systems. And then there's the systems that exist that are non-open sourced. The U.S. has systems that are non-open sourced that would be used, and I'm talking future-facing drone capability, unmanned subsurface drone capability, decades ahead of anything the Chinese have. So this posturing by China, I don't right now believe that the Chinese are actually preparing to try and use military force to take Taiwan. After reassessing capability, especially the capability that exists in the U.S. subsurface fleet, and the strategy that would be used by the U.S. to prevent this blockade of Taiwan. Because that's the only real scenario that China could use to pressure the capitulation of Taiwan is a blockade. At this point, right now, where we're at right now, China does not have the ability to conduct a successful amphibious operation against Taiwan. And especially an amphibious operation that would be opposed by the U.S. subsurface fleet, its attack submarines. Much more advanced. And then again, we continue to hear about these military scenarios, these military simulations that would create huge amounts of casualties, supposedly on the U.S. side. And you constantly hear about the prospects of multiple U.S. destroyers being sunk, possibly cruisers, even aircraft carriers being struck by these hypersonic ballistic missiles. Now, these systems, these surface-based systems, these aircraft carriers, these battle groups that the U.S. has, wouldn't be used in this conflict. They would be pulled back, and it would be the subsurface fleet, and it would be, to some extent, the stealth bomber fleet, the B-2, the B-21 Raider. Those systems would be used to attack Chinese staging areas along the coast of China, If they needed to target those, they could. But again, I don't believe at this point it would be a scenario where China would be attempting to try this amphibious landing. Those amphibious ships would be blown to hell by that attack submarine fleet of the United States Navy. It just would. And then the Chinese surface fleet that would be operating north and to the east and to the south in open ocean would just have a devil of a time dealing with that U.S. subsurface fleet made up of these submarines that I've just talked about. They would be perpetual, it would be aggressive, and it would be never-ending for the Chinese. And again, the technology gap that exists between the U.S. subsurface fleet and the Chinese subsurface fleet is a gap the size of the Grand Canyon. Believe it or not, it is. It is very, very much so. Are the Chinese trying to catch up? Are they trying to make headway in terms of subsurface capability? Yeah, they are. They are. But they are far, far behind. And the idea that they would eventually catch up is a long way off. You're going to have to look decades into the future, maybe. You'd have to see some sort of economic calamity take place in the United States that would create an environment where research is decreased, funding is decreased, and then eventually the Chinese were to catch up. But right now, in the space that we exist now, with the Virginia class, and then kind of looking just 5-10 years down the road, when the Chinese have talked about launching this operation to seek the capitulation of Taiwan, it would be a very, very difficult time for the Chinese if it became a shooting war, if the Chinese made the mistake of trying to blockade Taiwan. Very difficult, especially with U.S. intervention, subsurface intervention. That would be the crux of this conflict. That would be the component of this conflict that no one is talking about. The subsurface capability and the drone capability, the subsurface drone capability that the U.S. has. Again, you would see weapon systems that are not open to the public domain that would be used. You would hear about and you would see Chinese large surface vessels, destroyers, frigates being sunk, being destroyed, and there would not be a great deal of knowledge on how those vessels were sinking. And we would know that it's subsurface, that there's some subsurface capability the U.S. is using, and on the surface it would be submarine-based operations, nuclear attack submarine operations, but it would also be other systems as well. Again, those non-open source systems that the U.S. certainly has, that is ultra classified and not really talked about. But again, I recently had the opportunity of watching that Daily Mail scenario, and just absolutely ridiculous, and again, designed for the consumption of the uninformed urbanite who really has no concept of really what would happen. So as always, thanks for joining us. More to come. Have a good day.